It was a quiet night in a small village nestled between hills and forests. The air was still, and the sky was unusually clear with countless stars twinkling far above. Families were asleep in their homes, and the village seemed to hold its breath in the calm darkness. But far away from the cozy houses, a strange presence hovered silently, something no one in the village could understand. Inside one of the houses, a little girl slept peacefully in her bed. She was small, with curious eyes that had always seemed to notice more than others. Her room was filled with toys and drawings she had made during the day. Bright colors scattered across the floor like tiny pieces of happiness. Outside her window, the moonlight fell softly on the walls, painting them silver. The night seemed ordinary, but it was about to become something no one could have imagined. Without warning, a light brighter than the moon filled the room. It was not warm or comforting. It was sharp, almost blinding. The little girl woke up, blinking rapidly, trying to understand what was happening. At first, she thought it might be lightning, but the sky outside was calm. She felt a strange sensation in the air, like it was moving around her, brushing against her skin. Her heart began to beat faster. Before she could even scream, something unusual and terrifying appeared in her room. From the shadows, enormous shapes began to take form. At first, she could not see them clearly, only catch glimpses of scales, wings, and glowing eyes. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. They were dragons, but unlike any dragons she had ever heard of in stories. Their bodies were immense, covered with shimmering scales that reflected the light and colors she had never seen before. Their eyes glowed faintly like tiny suns, and their presence filled the room with a mix of fear and awe. The dragons did not speak, but she felt them watching her. Not in a playful way, not as a predator would, but as something intelligent, calculating, and strangely alive. She could feel their gaze, heavy and impossible to ignore, sweeping over her. The little girl pressed herself against the wall, her tiny hands clutching her blanket. She had never been so afraid in her life. Her thoughts raced wildly. Why are they here? Are they going to hurt me? Suddenly, one of the dragons moved closer. Its long neck stretched gracefully, and it lowered its head near her. The little girl froze. She expected a roar or an attack, but nothing like that happened. Instead, there was a strange, almost gentle vibration in the air. She could feel it in her chest, in her bones, something deep that she couldn't name. It was as if the dragon's presence alone carried a message, though she could not understand it. Then, all at once, the dragons formed a circle around her. Their massive bodies created a barrier between her and the rest of the room, and beyond them, the windows and doors seemed to shimmer with a strange light. The little girl realized with growing horror and fascination that she was completely surrounded. There was no escape, but also no immediate danger, at least not yet. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes passed like hours as she watched the dragons. Their movements were slow and deliberate, each one adjusting slightly, shifting its wings or curling its tail. It was like watching a dance, a performance that was frightening yet mesmerizing. The little girl wanted to cry, but tears did not come. She felt frozen, as if her mind had been caught between fear and awe. Then something even stranger happened. The dragons began to make soft sounds, vibrations that pulsed through the air. They were not roars or growls, they were more like whispers, impossible for human ears to fully grasp. The little girl could feel the sounds in her chest and stomach, an odd connection that made her feel both smaller and larger at the same time. She realized she was no longer just a girl in a room. She was part of something vast and unknown. For a moment, the world outside her window seemed to disappear. The stars, the trees, the hills, they all faded into the background as she focused entirely on the dragons. And then she noticed something she had not seen before. The dragons were not just observing her, they were guarding her. She could not explain it. She had assumed they were kidnappers, monsters sent to harm her, but now it felt as if they were protecting her from something she could not see. The little girl shivered, her fear mixing with curiosity. She wanted to ask questions, to speak, but no words came. Her voice felt small and fragile compared to the presence surrounding her. She watched as one of the dragons lowered its massive wings slightly, creating a space in the circle. It was almost like an invitation, though she did not understand why. Slowly, she stepped forward, her tiny feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. As she approached, the dragon's glowing eyes followed her, but there was no aggression. Instead, there was a strange intelligence there, a recognition of her movement, her hesitation, her courage. She held her hands out, unsure if she should touch it, and the dragon lowered its head further. For the first time, she felt something akin to trust. Not full trust, of course, she was still terrified, but a small, fragile connection that made her feel less alone. Hours seemed to pass, though it could have been minutes. The little girl began to notice the smallest details, the texture of the dragon's scales, the faint warmth of their bodies, the rhythm of their breathing. She could almost feel their thoughts in the vibrations they emitted. Every now and then one would tilt its head as if asking a question, and she would nod slowly, unsure if it understood. It was like learning a new language, one made of gestures, vibrations, and unspoken understanding. As the night went on, the little girl began to feel less afraid, though she never stopped being cautious. The dragons did not harm her, and in a strange way they seemed to be waiting for something unknown, something beyond her understanding. She realized that whatever had brought them here was part of a much larger story, one she could not yet grasp. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, the little girl had changed. She was no longer just a frightened child. She was a witness to something extraordinary, something that had no place in ordinary life. The dragon still circled her, still glowing softly, still vibrating in ways she could feel but not fully understand, and she knew deep down that her life would never be the same again. Outside, the village remained unaware. Parents began to wake, children rubbed their eyes, and the day began as it always did. But for one small girl, the ordinary world had been replaced by something unimaginable, something alive, dangerous, intelligent, and strangely protective. She had been taken by dragons, yes, but what kind of dragons, and why they had surrounded her, remained a mystery. Even as she drifted into a restless sleep at the edge of the dragon circle, the little girl could feel them watching, waiting, guarding. She could feel a strange bond forming, a connection that she would not fully understand for many years to come. And though she could not explain it, she knew this night would be remembered not just by her, but by something far greater than herself, a story of fear, wonder, and the first touch of a world beyond human understanding. The night had started like any other, quiet and peaceful, but it had ended with a circle of glowing, watchful eyes, and a little girl on the edge of a new reality. She did not yet know the journey that lay ahead, or the strange events that would follow, but she had taken her first step into a story that would change her forever. The little girl woke up to a strange light filtering into the space around her. It wasn't sunlight, at least not like she had ever seen. It was softer, almost like the room itself was glowing from within. Her eyes slowly adjusted and she realized she was still surrounded by the dragons. They hadn't left, and their presence was no longer just terrifying. It was intriguing. She could see every detail now. Their scales shimmered like melted metal, each scale reflecting faint colors that shifted as they moved. Their wings folded and stretched with a grace that seemed almost musical, though no sound came from them. For the first time since her abduction, the girl began to observe the dragons closely. She noticed how they moved together, almost like dancers in a carefully choreographed performance. When one turned, the others adjusted slightly as if they were communicating silently. She could see subtle shifts in their eyes, tiny sparks of color, and small vibrations in the air around them. Somehow she understood that these were not just random movements. There was intelligence behind every action, a thought process she could not begin to comprehend. Curiosity began to push aside her fear. She had always been observant, always asked questions about everything around her. Now in this strange, otherworldly place, her curiosity grew stronger. She began to inch forward, studying one dragon at a time. She noticed how its tail twitched when it was alert, how its eyes followed her movements carefully. She could feel the air vibrate slightly when they breathed. Every tiny sound, every subtle movement seemed to tell a story she longed to understand. At first she spoke softly, testing her voice in the strange silence. "Hello?" she whispered. Her voice felt small, almost swallowed by the massive creatures around her. The dragons did not respond the way any human would expect. There was no roar, no growl, no sudden movement. Instead, the air shifted and she felt a soft hum in her chest, like the dragons were listening in their own way. She tried again, "Can you hear me?" And a shiver ran down her spine as a vibration pulsed through the space. It was as if they were acknowledging her presence, though she couldn't be sure. Hours passed like this. She learned to move slowly to avoid startling them. She discovered patterns in their behavior. When one dragon raised its wing, another would lean slightly forward. When one flicked its tail, the others adjusted their stance. She realized she could predict some of their movements, and in doing so, she felt a strange sense of control, not over them, but over her own fear. She was learning to exist in this space, to observe without panic, and to slowly understand the rhythm of these incredible beings. Then, one dragon approached her more closely than the others. It lowered its massive head until its glowing eyes were level with hers. The girl froze, unsure what to do, but instead of aggression, there was curiosity in its gaze. She extended her hand slowly, trembling slightly, and the dragon lowered its snout near her palm. When she touched it, she felt a surprising warmth, almost like a pulse of life she could feel in her fingertips. For the first time, she realized that they were not just guarding her, they were aware of her, almost like they were studying her as carefully as she was studying them. Over the next days, or perhaps hours, she could no longer tell. The girl learned more about the dragon's habits. They were not mindless beasts. They had routines, rituals, and even what seemed like communication. They moved in patterns that she began to recognize, and she noticed subtle differences in the vibrations they emitted. She experimented by moving closer or stepping back, watching how they reacted. Sometimes a dragon would tilt its head, and she felt the faintest connection, as if it were trying to show her something without words. One day, she noticed a small, delicate behavior that caught her attention. A young dragon, smaller than the rest, was curled up near the edge of the circle. Its scales were less vibrant, its wings slightly folded, and it seemed hesitant to move. The girl approached slowly, feeling a surge of empathy. She knelt near it and whispered, "It's okay. I won't hurt you." To her astonishment, the dragon responded, not with a roar, but with a faint vibration that she could feel through the floor. It was subtle but unmistakable, like a sigh. She realized then that they were capable of emotions or something very close to them, and that she could influence their feelings through calmness and patience. She began to test these small interactions carefully. She would reach out her hand, speak softly, or sit quietly near them. Each time, the dragons reacted slightly differently, some leaning in closer, others watching silently. She started to sense a pattern. The more gentle and patient she was, the more they seemed to accept her. It was not friendship in the way humans understood it, but something deeper, a mutual recognition that neither was a threat to the other. At night, when the space was quieter, and the glow of the dragon's eyes filled the darkness, she would lie down near the center of their circle and watch the shadows of their massive wings stretch across the walls. She began to notice subtle differences in their scales, like patterns or markings that seemed to hold meaning. Some scales shimmered brighter than others. Some colors shifted when she moved. She wondered if these patterns were a form of language, a way of communicating among themselves. The thought made her feel both excited and nervous. Could she ever understand them fully? The little girl also began to notice how the dragons protected her. From her hiding spots, she could see that they were alert to every movement, every sound in their surroundings. If something approached from the outside, a small animal, a shifting shadow, the dragons would react immediately, circling slightly or raising a wing in warning. She realized that their initial presence in her room was not random. They were not merely keeping her trapped. They were keeping her safe from a world she could not yet see. As the days, or what felt like days, passed, the girl's fear slowly began to transform into fascination. She started keeping a mental record of everything she observed, how each dragon moved, how they reacted to vibrations and sounds, and how the small changes in her own behavior influenced their responses. She even began experimenting with small gestures, waving her hands or moving slowly to see if the dragons would mimic or respond. It was exhausting work, but thrilling. She was learning to interact with creatures that existed far beyond human understanding. One morning, she noticed something extraordinary. A faint shimmering light appeared around one of the dragon's eyes, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. She reached out her hand slowly, and the dragon moved its head closer, letting her sense the vibration more clearly. She could feel a strange warmth, a connection that went beyond sight or sound. For the first time, she felt almost as if she could understand what the dragon was experiencing, not in words, but in feelings, in vibrations, in the unspoken language of presence. That night, she sat quietly near the center of their circle, watching the dragon's eyes glow softly in the dark. She realized that she was learning something extraordinary. Fear could coexist with curiosity, and even in the presence of beings far more powerful than herself, patience, observation, and courage could create understanding. She was no longer just a little girl trapped in a room. She was becoming a part of something larger, a witness to intelligence and care in forms she had never imagined. By the end of what she began to call her first week with them, the little girl had changed in ways she could not explain. She moved with more confidence, observed more carefully, and felt more connected to the strange creatures around her. The dragons were no longer just terrifying guardians. They were teachers in a way, showing her a world of patterns, communication, and behavior beyond human comprehension. She realized that she was slowly learning to coexist with them, to navigate their strange rhythms, and to understand that danger and protection could be inseparably linked. And though she was still a prisoner of circumstance, she felt a sense of agency she had never experienced before. She could move, explore, observe, and interact. She could communicate in the smallest of ways, shaping the dragon's responses through patience and care. She understood that the dragons were not monsters. They were something else entirely. Beings with their own rules, their own intelligence, and their own ways of protecting the world around them, including her. For the little girl, the days with the dragons had become a strange mixture of fear, wonder, and discovery. Each day brought new patterns, new surprises, and new opportunities to connect. She did not yet know why they had chosen to encircle her, or what fate had brought her into their presence. But she understood one thing clearly. This was only the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would challenge everything she had ever known about life, danger, and the bonds that could exist between beings from completely different worlds. And so, she watched, she learned, she experimented, and she waited. She waited for the next strange event, the next signal, the next moment that might change everything again. For now she was alive, she was learning, and she was surrounded, not by monsters, but by guardians whose intentions she was slowly beginning to understand. The little girl had grown accustomed to the dragons around her. She no longer flinched at the glow of their eyes or the soft vibrations that pulsed through the air. She had learned their movements, understood their rhythms, and even felt a strange connection to some of them. Still, something about the space around them unsettled her in ways she could not explain. The dragons were powerful, intelligent, and careful, but there were moments when their attention seemed divided. They would glance toward the edges of the space, their bodies tensing slightly, their eyes glowing brighter, and their tails flicking in sudden, sharp motions. At first, the little girl thought it was her imagination. Perhaps she was seeing shadows where there were none, or maybe her mind was exaggerating their movements. But then one day she noticed something she could not ignore. A flicker of movement beyond the dragon's circle, a shadow that did not belong, a presence that seemed to drift in the darkness just beyond their protective barrier. It was subtle, almost impossible to see, but she felt it. She froze, her heart pounding, and the dragons immediately responded. Wings lifted slightly, heads turned, eyes glowed more intensely, and a low vibration filled the air. The girl realized with a shiver that she was not entirely safe, despite the dragon's presence. Whatever the shadow was, it was not human, and it was aware of her. The dragon's behavior confirmed it. They were alert, almost tense, as if anticipating an intrusion. She watched, fascinated and terrified at the same time, as the dragons subtly shifted positions, forming a tighter circle around her. It was as if they were saying without words, "Stay where you are, we will handle this." Curiosity overcame fear, as it often did with her. She wanted to see the threat more clearly, to understand what it was. Slowly she moved closer to the edge of the dragon's circle, careful not to provoke them. Immediately, one of the larger dragons blocked her path with a gentle sweep of its tail, a reminder that she was still a child in a dangerous place. She stopped, realizing the delicate balance she had been learning to navigate. Every move mattered, every action had consequences, and the dragons were the guardians, not playthings. Hours passed in tense observation. The little girl learned to watch the subtle signals the dragons gave her. The tilt of a head, the flick of a wing, the intensity of the glow in their eyes. These signals told her more about the shadow than she could see with her own eyes. She began to understand that the dragons had ways of detecting things beyond her perception, movements, energy, presence, and that their vigilance was not arbitrary. They were protecting her from something invisible, something that could be dangerous if she stepped out of line. One evening, as the light outside shifted in strange, soft hues, she noticed a change in the dragons' behavior. Their eyes glowed brighter, their tails flicked faster, and a low vibration pulsed through the floor, almost like a warning. She felt a wave of fear run through her. Something was approaching, something she could not see, and the dragons were preparing for it. She knelt down, trying to make herself smaller, and watched as the largest dragon stepped forward, wings partially spread, forming a protective barrier. It was a silent, terrifying display of power, and the little girl felt both awe and relief. As she observed, she began to notice tiny glimpses of the shadow. It moved differently than any creature she had seen before. It was quick, almost ethereal, slipping between light and darkness, and yet it carried a sense of intent. She could not tell if it was hostile or merely curious, but the dragon's tension told her that it was dangerous. She realized, with a mixture of fear and wonder, that the world she had entered was far more complex than she had imagined. It was not just the dragons or herself. It was a larger ecosystem of beings, some of whom could harm her if she was not careful. The little girl began experimenting carefully, learning to interpret the dragon's warnings and signals. When the shadow moved closer, she noticed subtle changes in the dragon's vibrations. They were not just protecting her physically, they were communicating, coordinating, anticipating. She began to understand that her own actions could influence their responses. If she stayed calm, observed carefully, and followed their subtle cues, the dragons remained in control and the shadow kept its distance. But if she moved recklessly, the tension in the space increased. The vibrations became harsher, and she felt a surge of fear ripple through her body. Days, or what she assumed were days, passed in this rhythm of observation and cautious interaction. The little girl became more attuned to the dragons, learning to read their signals as if they were a language. She noticed patterns. The flick of a tail indicated caution. The tilt of a head indicated curiosity. The intensity of the eye glow indicated alertness or alarm. By understanding these patterns, she felt a growing sense of agency, even in a place that was still dangerous and unpredictable. One particularly quiet night, she noticed something remarkable. The shadow she had been sensing was not acting alone. There were subtle signs of movement around it, faint shifts in the air, almost imperceptible. She realized that there was an entire presence she could not see, a threat hidden in layers of energy or light, something the dragons could detect but she could not. For the first time, she felt the true scale of the world she had entered. It was not just the dragons and herself. It was a complex environment of beings, energies, and intentions, and she was a tiny, fragile part of it. The dragons' vigilance intensified. They formed tighter circles, wings overlapping, tails brushing the floor to create subtle vibrations that the girl could feel. The little girl understood instinctively that the dragons were not aggressive without reason. They were strategic, protective, and intelligent. She watched as one of the younger dragons stepped slightly forward, wings half raised, eyes glowing intensely. It was as if the creature was signaling her to stay close, to remain calm, to trust the protection around her. Curiosity, however, could not be suppressed. She wanted to understand the shadow, to see it, to know why it was there. She tried to peek beyond the dragon's circle just enough to catch a glimpse, and immediately felt the tension rise. The dragons shifted, forming a near-perfect barrier, eyes fixed in the direction of the unseen presence. The little girl realized she was not meant to confront it, at least not yet. This was their territory, their responsibility, and her role was to observe, learn, and follow their guidance. As days continued, the little girl began to notice more subtle patterns. The shadow moved in response to the dragons, testing, probing, sometimes retreating when the dragons adjusted. She realized that this unseen presence was intelligent, adaptive, and aware of her too, though indirectly. It was as if the world she had entered operated on rules beyond human comprehension, where observation, patience, and careful understanding could mean the difference between safety and danger. At one point, she noticed something extraordinary. The dragons, while focused on the shadow, began to communicate among themselves in ways she could feel. Vibrations, eye glows, subtle shifts in posture. It was not a sound she could hear, but she could sense it in her chest and stomach. She realized they were coordinating, sharing information, strategizing, almost as if they were aware of her presence and her need to understand without exposing her to danger. For the first time, she felt a deep respect for these creatures. They were not simply terrifying beings, they were intelligent, careful, and protective. They had recognized her vulnerability and had taken responsibility for her safety, even in the face of a threat she could not see. The little girl felt a mix of gratitude and awe, realizing that her fear was tempered by a growing understanding of the dragon's nature. At night, she would lie quietly in the center of the circle, eyes open, feeling the vibrations of the dragon's bodies around her. She noticed subtle changes in their behavior depending on the movement of the shadow. Sometimes the tension was high, and she could feel the air shift as if the dragons were holding themselves in readiness. Other times the shadow seemed to retreat, and the dragons relaxed slightly, allowing her a moment of calm. She began to understand that this rhythm of tension and relaxation was a part of life in this strange place, a life she was slowly learning to navigate. By the end of what she considered another cycle of days, the little girl had grown more confident in her observations. She could sense the shadow without seeing it, understand the dragon's warnings, and even predict some of the subtle changes in the environment. She realized that she was not powerless. Her careful attention, patience, and willingness to learn gave her a role in this strange ecosystem. She was still small and fragile, but she was learning to exist in a world that was vast, dangerous, and alive in ways she had never imagined. And though the shadow remained unseen, the little girl felt a growing sense of connection to the dragons and their vigilance. She knew that this was only part of the story, that the world she had entered held deeper mysteries, more threats, and even greater wonders. But for now she was learning, observing and surviving one careful step at a time, guided by creatures she had once feared and now came to respect. She understood, in a way she could not fully articulate, that the dragons were not her captors. They were guardians. And the shadow, mysterious and unseen, was a reminder that the world around them was far more complex than she had. The little girl had been living among the dragons for what she thought were many days, though time had taken on a strange quality in their presence. The rhythm of her life had changed. Fear was no longer her constant companion. Curiosity and fascination had started to take its place. She had learned to read the subtle vibrations and movements of the dragons, to sense their moods and to understand in a small way the unspoken language that connected them all. One morning, as the soft light filtered through the edges of the space, she noticed something new. One of the dragons, smaller and younger than the others, was moving differently. Its wings fluttered slightly, its head tilted toward her in a way that suggested recognition. The little girl froze, a mix of excitement and hesitation running through her. For the first time, it felt like the dragon was intentionally acknowledging her presence, not just as a human to guard, but as a being it could interact with. She took a small, careful step forward. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the faint hum of vibrations in the air. The young dragon responded with a soft pulse, a vibration that she could feel in her chest and stomach. It was a gentle, almost shy response, and it filled her with awe. She realized that the creatures were not just intelligent, they were capable of curiosity and perhaps even something like emotion. Encouraged, she began to experiment carefully with her movements and gestures. She raised her hand slowly, and the dragon mirrored the motion in its own way, lowering its head as if trying to understand. She took a few steps closer, keeping her voice calm and steady. The dragon did not move away or tense. Instead, it seemed to relax slightly, its glowing eyes softening. She had taken her first step in forming a bond, and the sensation was thrilling. The little girl spent hours observing this young dragon. She began to notice patterns in its behavior, how it reacted to different sounds, movements, and vibrations. Sometimes she would tap lightly on the floor, and the dragon would respond with a matching rhythm. Other times she would speak softly, and the vibrations in the air would shift almost like a conversation. She realized that communication with these beings was not about words, but about presence, patience, and careful attention. As the days passed, the girl grew bolder. She started approaching other dragons, testing their reactions, learning the nuances of each one. Some were curious, leaning in closer to study her movements. Others were cautious, keeping their distance while observing her with glowing eyes. She learned to respect their boundaries, moving slowly and deliberately, always mindful of their signals. Each interaction became a lesson in trust, patience, and understanding. One afternoon, she noticed a remarkable change. The younger dragon she had bonded with began to follow her gently as she moved through the circle. It stayed close, but never too close, allowing her space while still remaining connected. She realized that the bond was mutual. The dragon was as curious about her as she was about it. She spoke softly, reaching out her hand, and the dragon responded with a gentle nudge, a vibration that felt like an acknowledgement of friendship. The little girl also began to notice subtle signs of emotion in the dragons. When one of the older dragons shifted protectively, she could feel concern in the vibrations. When another moved in a slower, rhythmic pattern, she sensed calmness and patience. She was learning that these creatures were not simply dangerous guardians, they were beings capable of feeling, of responding to presence, and of forming connections beyond fear and instinct. Encouraged by these discoveries, the girl started experimenting further. She would offer small gestures of trust, a gentle touch, a slow movement, a calm presence, and watch how the dragons responded. Some leaned in, mirroring her movements. Others observed quietly, their glowing eyes following her with careful attention. She realized that these interactions were teaching her as much about herself as they were about the dragons. She was learning courage, patience, and the power of calm observation. One evening, as the soft glow of the dragons filled the space, she noticed a particularly extraordinary moment. The young dragon approached her and lowered its head until its snout was nearly touching her hand. She extended her palm slowly, and the dragon nudged it gently. The sensation was electric in a subtle way, a vibration that resonated deep within her. It was a clear sign of trust, a first step toward a bond that transcended fear. She felt a rush of emotion, a mix of awe, gratitude, and wonder. The girl began to understand that the dragon's protective behavior was not merely instinctual. They had chosen to watch over her, to include her in their circle, and even to respond to her gestures. She was not just a passive observer, she was part of their world, learning its rules, understanding its rhythms, and forming connections that no human language could fully describe. As the days continued, the girl's confidence grew. She started moving more freely among the dragons, observing them closely and responding to their subtle signals. She noticed how they interacted with each other, how they shifted in unison, and how they responded to the energy of the space around them. Each observation was a lesson, and each lesson strengthened her bond with the creatures around her. One particularly quiet morning, she noticed that the dragons seemed to respond to her mood. When she was calm and focused, they moved smoothly, their wings stretching and folding with grace. When she hesitated or felt fear, their vibrations grew more intense, their eyes brightening in alertness. She realized that her presence and her emotions could influence their behavior, creating a delicate, mutual understanding. Encouraged by this discovery, the little girl began to test the limits of this bond. She would move closer to the younger dragon, speaking softly, and watch its response. Sometimes it leaned in, nudging her gently. Sometimes it stayed back, observing with careful curiosity. Each interaction was a lesson in trust, patience, and understanding, lessons she had never learned in the ordinary world of her village. The bond she formed was not without challenges. There were moments when the dragon's attention shifted suddenly, when they tensed in response to unseen movements or distant vibrations. The girl learned to remain calm, to observe without panic, and to trust that the dragon's vigilance was a form of protection. She realized that fear and trust could coexist, and that understanding and patience could turn even the most terrifying creatures into allies. Over time, the little girl discovered a rhythm in her interactions with the dragons. Mornings were for observation and learning, afternoons for careful experimentation, and evenings for quiet connection. She would lie near the center of the circle, feeling the gentle vibrations of the dragons' bodies, watching their glowing eyes, and sensing the subtle shifts in their energy. She felt connected in a way she had never experienced before, part of a world that was alive, intelligent, and responsive. One evening, as the space glowed softly around them, the girl noticed a moment that would stay with her forever. The younger dragon she had bonded with moved closer than ever, lowering its massive head until their foreheads nearly touched. The vibration she felt was stronger, more direct, as if the dragon was trying to communicate something beyond simple gestures. She closed her eyes and concentrated, feeling a connection that went deeper than observation or mimicry. For the first time, she sensed understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that they were no longer strangers, but beings who had formed a bond through patience, trust, and presence. The little girl realized that she had changed as much as the dragons had. She had learned courage in the face of fear, patience in the face of uncertainty, and understanding in the face of the unknown. The dragons, in turn, had begun to respond to her presence in ways that suggested recognition, curiosity, and even care. She was no longer simply a child surrounded by creatures of unimaginable power. She was part of their world, learning its rules, forming connections, and discovering that even being so different from herself could share something profound. As the days continued, she became bolder, moving among the dragons with confidence and care. She learned to anticipate their movements, to respond to their signals, and to understand the subtle rhythms of their interactions. Each gesture, each vibration, each movement became a form of communication, a shared understanding that transcended words and species. And though she was still a child in a world of immense and dangerous creatures, she felt a growing sense of belonging. She had formed bonds that went beyond fear, connections that were built on patience, trust, and mutual respect. She understood that the dragons were not merely guardians, they were teachers, companions, and allies in a world that was larger and stranger than anything she had ever known. For the little girl, life with the dragons had become a delicate dance of observation, understanding, and connection. Every day brought new lessons, new discoveries, and new opportunities to deepen her bond with these incredible creatures. And though she knew there were challenges ahead, unseen threats, unknown dangers, and mysteries yet to unfold, she also knew that she had found allies in the most unexpected of places. The dragons were no longer frightening. They were wise, powerful, and alive in ways she had never imagined. And she, a small girl from a quiet village, had become part of their circle, learning, growing, and forming bonds that would shape her understanding of the world for years to come. The little girl had grown more confident in her movements among the dragons. She had learned to watch, to listen, and to feel the subtle vibrations that pulsed through the space around her. She could sense the rhythm of the dragons, their moods, and their intentions. Yet she knew that something was about to happen. Something different, something she could not yet understand. The air felt heavier than usual, charged with energy that made the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end. It began quietly. The dragon's eyes, which usually glowed softly, began to shimmer with an intensity she had never seen before. The younger dragon, her closest companion, nudged her gently as if to warn her. The vibrations in the air grew stronger, pulsing in waves that she could feel in her chest. She knelt down instinctively, placing her hands on the ground, trying to remain calm. She could sense that the dragons were alert, readying themselves for something significant. Then it happened. A strange shimmer appeared in the air around the dragons, like heat waves on a summer road, but more vivid, more alive. The light moved, shifted, and wrapped itself around the creatures, causing their scales to glint and sparkle in ways the girl had never imagined. She felt a shiver of awe and fear run through her. She had seen them glowing before, but this was different. It was alive, intelligent, almost as if the dragons themselves were being transformed by the energy. The young dragon nudged her again, but this time it stayed closer, almost protective. The girl extended her hands slowly, reaching toward the shimmering light. To her astonishment, the vibrations she felt were no longer just coming from the dragons. They seemed to connect through her very body, as if she had become part of the energy itself. She felt warmth, awareness, and something deeper she could not name. It was as though the dragons' minds were reaching out to hers, silently sharing thought, feeling, and understanding. The experience was overwhelming. She closed her eyes, letting the vibrations flow through her. She could sense the presence of the dragons as never before, their thoughts, their emotions, their instincts. It was as if the walls between species had disappeared, leaving only awareness, curiosity, and connection. She realized she could sense their concern, their focus, and even the smallest flicker of curiosity. It was a strange and extraordinary feeling, one that filled her with awe and wonder. Suddenly, the shimmer in the air began to move toward her. It was not threatening, but it carried an undeniable force. The dragons shifted closer, forming a protective circle, their eyes glowing brighter than ever. The little girl could feel their intent, their readiness to defend her if necessary. She realized that this energy, this strange light, was responding not just to the dragons, but to her as well. She was a participant, not a bystander, in a moment unlike anything she had ever experienced. As the energy pulsed around her, she noticed something extraordinary. The young dragon she had bonded with nudged her gently again, and this time she could sense something more than awareness. It was communication. Not in words, not in gestures, but in feeling. She felt curiosity, reassurance, and an almost human-like care directed toward her. She extended her hand, trembling slightly, and the dragon lowered its massive head until it was level with hers. The vibrations she felt were intense, clear, and astonishingly intimate, as if the dragon's mind was brushing against hers. She gasped softly. She could understand in a strange, wordless way what the dragons were sensing. The energy around them was powerful, intelligent, and aware. The dragons had noticed it before her, and now, through this connection, she could feel their response, their strategies, and even their warnings. She realized that she was not just an observer, she was part of this moment, linked to the dragons in a way that transcended fear and species. The shimmer of energy moved closer still, weaving through the dragons' bodies, causing them to shift and vibrate. The little girl could feel every movement as if it were her own. It was overwhelming, yet she felt no harm. The dragon's protective presence reassured her, guiding her through the waves of energy and light. For the first time, she understood that these creatures were not simply guardians. They were conduits of a world she could barely comprehend, and she was connected to it in a way that few humans ever would be. She experimented carefully, moving her hand through the vibrations, trying to sense the responses. To her astonishment, the young dragon mirrored her movements, nudging her hand gently with its snout. She could feel the pulse of life and awareness flowing through the creature, responding to her gestures. The experience was surreal. She realized that she was learning a new form of communication, one based on energy, presence, and unspoken understanding rather than words. The larger dragons shifted around her, their wings creating faint vibrations in the air. She noticed patterns she had not seen before. The way their tails flicked, the intensity of their glowing eyes, the rhythm of their movements. She realized that this was not just a connection with one dragon, it was a connection with the entire group. She felt their collective awareness, their intelligence, and their care, all focused on her and the strange energy that had appeared. Hours passed, though she could not tell how long. The shimmer of energy pulsed and moved, the dragons shifted and vibrated, and she remained at the center, learning, feeling, and understanding. She began to sense subtle messages, patterns of thought and emotion that the dragons were sending her. She realized that this connection was a form of teaching, a way for her to understand the world they inhabited without words. She felt gratitude, awe, and a deep sense of wonder. At one point, the energy seemed to respond directly to her thoughts and feelings. When she felt curiosity, it pulsed with a subtle intensity. When she felt fear, the dragon's presence intensified, creating a protective bubble around her. She realized with astonishment that she could influence the flow of this energy through her own calmness, presence, and attention. She was part of a dialogue that transcended language, species, and even physical form. The young dragon, sensing her growing confidence, nudged her hand again, and she reached out. The vibrations flowed through her, connecting her even more deeply to the creatures around her. She felt their intelligence, their care, and their curiosity as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat. For the first time, she understood that the bond she had formed was not merely emotional. It was a bridge between two forms of life, a shared awareness that transcended fear and danger. The shimmer of energy began to fade slowly, withdrawing from the dragons and moving toward the edges of the space. The dragons relaxed slightly, their glowing eyes softening, but the girl could still feel the connection, the awareness, and the understanding that had been established. She realized that this extraordinary event had changed everything. She was no longer simply a human among dragons. She was part of a shared consciousness, connected in a way that was both frightening and beautiful. As the light dimmed and the vibrations settled, the little girl felt a profound sense of wonder. She understood that the dragons had chosen to include her in this moment, to share their awareness and intelligence with her. She realized that she had been part of something extraordinary, a connection few humans could ever experience. She felt gratitude, awe, and a new understanding of the world around her. For the first time, she could sense the dragon's thoughts and feelings clearly. She could feel their curiosity, their vigilance, and their care for her. She understood that their protection was not just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual in a way she could barely articulate. She felt a profound bond with them, one that would not fade even after the energy had disappeared. That night, as she lay quietly in the center of the circle, she reflected on what had happened. She realized that she had experienced something beyond fear and survival. She had felt connection, understanding, and shared awareness. She had learned that intelligence, care, and protection could exist in forms she had never imagined. And she had discovered that courage, patience, and attention could allow her to participate in a world far larger and stranger than anything she had known. The little girl closed her eyes and let the vibrations of the dragons wash over her. She felt part of something greater, a shared consciousness of life, energy, and awareness. She understood that this moment would change her forever. The dragons were no longer just creatures of power. They were allies, teachers, and companions. And she, a small child from a quiet village, had been included in something extraordinary, something beyond words and beyond human understanding. She knew that the journey was far from over. The energy, the dragons, and the world around her still held mysteries, challenges, and wonders. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had formed bonds that transcended fear, species, and language. She had learned to observe, to communicate, and to connect in ways she had never imagined. And she understood with deep certainty that this was only the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold in ways both strange and magnificent. The little girl awoke to a soft, warm light filtering into the space. It was familiar now, yet different. The dragons were still around her, but there was a calmness in the air that she hadn't felt before. The strange energy that had connected her to them the day before had faded, leaving only a gentle hum that seemed to pulse in sync with her heartbeat. She stretched her hands, feeling the vibrations of the dragon's presence still lingering around her. Though the extraordinary connection had passed, she knew it had changed everything. As she observed the dragons, she realized how much she had learned. They had taught her more than she could have imagined: patience, courage, observation, and the understanding that connection could exist even between the most different of beings. She had felt their minds, their awareness, and their care in a way that transcended words. She had learned that power and protection could coexist with curiosity and compassion. Then, as she sat quietly, a strange sensation washed over her. The space around the dragon seemed to shift, the walls and floor subtly dissolving into a soft glow. The dragon stirred, and she felt a gentle pull, like a current guiding her somewhere. The young dragon she had bonded with nudged her hand gently, and she understood without words. It was time. The little girl followed instinctively. She rose to her feet and stepped toward the glowing light. The dragons flanked her on either side, forming a protective barrier. The energy that had connected her to them seemed to guide her steps, moving with her in a rhythm that was almost musical. She felt calm, fearless even, as if she had become part of a world far larger than herself. The space began to change around her. The glowing light intensified, forming a soft tunnel of illumination. She could feel the dragon's awareness around her, their silent communication guiding her forward. The young dragon pressed its head gently against her side, and she felt warmth and reassurance ripple through her body. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of certainty. She understood that she would be returning to her own world, but she would carry a piece of this extraordinary experience with her forever. As she moved through the tunnel of light, she glimpsed fleeting images, moments of her time with the dragons. She saw the first time she had reached out to the younger dragon, the hours of careful observation, the days spent learning their rhythms and behaviors. She saw the extraordinary moment when the energy had connected her to them, and she felt the vibrations of their shared awareness pulsing through her again, even if only faintly. Then, suddenly the light shifted and she was back. She blinked and found herself in her own room, sunlight streaming through the window, the familiar sounds of the village outside greeting her ears. For a moment she felt disoriented, as if the dragons and their world were just a dream, but the memory of the vibrations, the warmth, and the connection was vivid and real. She could still feel it in her chest, a gentle hum of awareness and care that lingered even in her familiar surroundings. The little girl sat quietly, trying to make sense of it all. She realized how much she had changed. Fear that had once gripped her so tightly had transformed into understanding. Curiosity had become her guide, teaching her that even in a world of danger and uncertainty, patience and observation could create connection and trust. She thought of the dragons, their intelligence, and the way they had cared for her. She smiled softly, feeling gratitude for the extraordinary creatures that had included her in their world. Over the next days, she tried to explain her experience to others, but words seemed inadequate. How could she describe vibrations she had felt through her chest, or the shared awareness of being so different from humans? Her parents noticed her change, how she moved more calmly, observed more keenly, and listened more deeply. They didn't understand the dragons or the strange energy she had experienced, but they could see that something remarkable had happened. She had grown, and her confidence and understanding were evident in every action. The little girl began to observe the world around her differently. She noticed small details, the way birds moved together, the subtle shifts in sunlight, the gentle rhythm of wind through the trees. She realized that connection, awareness, and care were not limited to dragons or extraordinary creatures. They existed everywhere in every life, waiting for patience and observation to reveal them. She felt a sense of wonder in her ordinary surroundings, knowing that even in the familiar, extraordinary truths could exist. At night, she would lie quietly in her room, thinking of the dragons and the energy that had connected them. She felt the faintest vibration still lingering in her chest, a reminder of the bond she had formed. She knew that one day she might return to the dragons, or they might return to her in ways she could not predict. But even if she never saw them again, she understood that the connection would remain. It had changed her perspective, her understanding of life, and her sense of what was possible. The little girl began to share her experiences in small ways, helping others see the world differently. She pointed out patterns in nature, taught patience and observation to her friends, and spoke of the importance of listening and understanding before acting. She did not reveal the dragons or the extraordinary energy. That was her secret. But the lessons she had learned were evident in her actions, words, and presence. People noticed her calmness, her curiosity, and her ability to navigate challenges with insight and courage. Months passed, and though the world seemed ordinary on the surface, the little girl knew it was anything but. She carried the lessons of the dragons with her in everything she did. She could feel connections in ways others could not, sense patterns in life, and understand that intelligence, care, and curiosity were everywhere, waiting to be noticed. She realized that the dragons had not only protected her, they had taught her to see, to feel, and to understand the invisible threads that connected all life. The little girl never forgot the shimmer of energy that had linked her to the dragons, nor the young dragon that had nudged her gently, guiding her through the extraordinary experience. She could still feel the vibrations, the presence, and the awareness that had changed her. It was a reminder that courage, patience, and trust could open doors to worlds beyond imagination. And though she lived in her own world now, she carried a piece of the dragons with her, a quiet, enduring knowledge that connection was possible across any boundary, that understanding could be built in silence, and that even in the face of danger, curiosity and care could create bonds that would last a lifetime. The little girl grew, carrying these lessons in her heart. She faced challenges with calm determination, observed the world with careful attention, and formed connections with people, animals, and the environment around her. She shared the essence of what she had learned, teaching through action rather than words, and inspiring those around her to notice the extraordinary in the ordinary. At the end of each day, as the sun set and the world quieted, she would think of the dragons, their glowing eyes, and the energy that had connected them. She would smile softly, feeling gratitude and wonder, knowing that she had been part of something remarkable. She understood that her life had been touched by a world far greater than she could have imagined, and that the lessons of courage, patience, observation, and connection would guide her forever. The little girl closed her eyes at night, listening to the subtle rhythms of her surroundings. She could feel the faintest echoes of the dragon's presence in her chest, a reminder that the extraordinary was never far away. She understood that life was full of mysteries waiting to be discovered, and that courage and curiosity could open doors to experiences beyond imagination. And so, she lived her life with a quiet confidence, a deep awareness, and a sense of wonder that never faded. The dragons had returned to their world. The extraordinary energy had faded, but the lessons, bonds, and awareness remained. The little girl knew that she had been changed forever, not just by fear, danger, or captivity, but by connection, understanding, and the extraordinary power of beings who saw her not just as a child, but as part of their world. She had learned that even in the most unexpected circumstances, extraordinary lessons could be found, and that courage, patience, and awareness could transform fear into understanding, isolation into connection, and danger into wisdom. The little girl had been part of a world far beyond her imagination, and she had returned forever changed, ready to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, and to live with wonder in every step she took.